Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Please note, this episode contains some explicit language. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and so to clarify, I'm Thos Ribbits and you're not, but neither of us are Angela Lansbury. Unless, of course, you do happen to be Angela Lansbury. If so, perhaps I could ask you to send me an email. I'd love to have a chat. One of the great pleasures of Musical Talk for me is the chance to meet people, creative people, from the world of musical theatre. And today it's my great pleasure to bring to you an interview with a man who's relatively new in terms of musical theatre writing, but I think we'll hear a great deal more of in the future. His name is James Robert Ball, and I know what you're thinking immediately. Yes, that sounds a little bit like Jason Robert Brown. Well, in both cases, yes, there is a similarity, but I think we have to blame the parents, frankly. But James Robert Ball, is a British writer, and I first came across him and his work at something called the Workers' Playground, which was a workshop cum tryout session for creative writers of musical theatre, both composers and lyricists, and performers, it must be said, which takes place periodically at the Union Theatre in Southwark. In this case, the Workers' Playground that I attended was actually in September last year, that's 2014. And there were a large number of songs and performances going on, some of which were excellent, some of which were average, and of course some of which were really quite poor, it must be said. But that was the point of the evening. It was an opportunity to try material out to see if it worked in a public performance environment. The proof of the pudding, as they say, is in the eating. And as Christmas is looming fairly quickly, you'll be able to do a lot of proving of your puddings shortly. But I digress. As I said, at this Workers' Playground, there were a number of songs which I thought were excellent. And then it dawned on me that the four performers and writers that I was most impressed by were George Stiles, famously of Stiles and Drew, Stuart Matthew Price, that most talented of performers, Finn Anderson, who'd impressed so thoroughly with his Alba at the 2014 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and James Robert Ball. And I realised that I'd had the pleasure of interviewing and talking to the first three at various times for Musical Talk, but I didn't know James. And given the quality of his work, I thought perhaps I should. And so that's what you're going to be hearing today, and indeed next week, because James very kindly consented to an interview, and it turned out to be absolutely fascinating. He's a man with many interests, and he's academically gifted. He's studying Sondheim at the moment, as well as writing his own musical, called Bang Out of Line, which is a contemporary musical adaptation of the Othello story by Shakespeare. And he's a thoughtful and intelligent person. In this part of the conversation today, you'll hear James talking about Bang Out of Line, his musical, but we'll also talk about the Cream Teas Conspiracy, which was a short musical he wrote in 2012. We also discuss the implications of a character having an accent, particularly if you're a lyricist. All this and lots of insights and conversation about Stephen Sondheim, who, as I said, is the subject of James's thesis. So, I hope that's whetted your appetite and that you enjoy this conversation with James Robert Ball. Musical Talk. James, thank you for agreeing to speak to Musical Talk, and more specifically to me. I would like to find a way of describing you, I think, at the beginning. I was going to go for composer, lyricist, pianist, academic, and trombonist. I will have said beforehand, I don't think you do all of those things at the same time, but is that a sort of thumbnail sketch of your versatility or range?
Goodness, I suppose I usually describe myself as a musician. That doesn't really encompass kind of lyric writing or the academic side, I suppose. So maybe in terms of earning money, I'm a musician. And then in terms of art and thinking about things, I'm also an academic and a writer.
Which is fairly good, if I may say.
Oh, and that's a bit smaller than all of that list that you did before. At least we've got three things.
Oh, yeah, but the intensity of them is coming across.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to be very honest. You're an up-and-coming composer. Mm-hmm. You have shows under your belt. You're a musical director as well. I'm adding things to your list now, you see, so I'm extending it up again. But the first time I came across you was at something called the Writers' Playground, which is a very excellent innovation at the Union Theatre, at least the time it was when I went to see it, which was trying to showcase in September of 2014 sort of what up-and-coming writers and composers were doing and showcasing songs from shows which had either been produced or were in the process of being developed. And I saw your excellent show, or I saw you amongst a whole number of performers. You were playing the piano and accompanying two excellent singers who sang 3 songs from your show, Bang Out of Line, a musical adaptation of Othello, of which we'll speak a little bit further in a minute. But of all the performers and writers that I saw that evening, 4 really stood out. 3 I'd previously interviewed for Musical Talk, so I immediately thought, there's a man I really ought to make a beeline for.
Makes sense.
And here we are, quite a slow beeline later. Describe the work at Writer's Playground from your point of view as a performer and writer. How important it really was as a concept, and what it's done for you, if it has done anything at all.
Well, I think it's a really important concept, and I think it was quite well executed in the end. This kind of thing is happening all the time in New York, but we don't have quite as much opportunity to have a kind of scratch night over on this side. It was really useful for me in terms of trying stuff out with an audience and to get feedback, definitely, but also just a good excuse to try stuff out with performers, because you can usually tell if the performer is struggling, you're not quite doing something right as a writer. Whereas as it happened, with a few edges knocked off, the 3 songs that I presented that evening have survived more or less intact from that experience, which is nice for me.
Now, those 3 songs, were from your show Bang Out of Line, which is an interesting take on Shakespeare's Othello, where Iago is, if you like, the central character. It's from his point of view, is that correct?
Yeah, he's who I've taken as the central point. I suppose he's not the romantic lead in a traditional sense like that, but...
He's a passionate lead, though.
Certainly. I guess I'm thinking about it in terms of structured writing and who's the hero, who's kind of fulfilling tasks and has come to a different place by the end of the show. He's who I've taken as my central hero. I suppose it jumped out of the notion that all baddies are the hero of their own stories. Similar to how Wicked is turned on its head from the original film, and we find out that actually this supposedly blank evil character has got quite a lot going on underneath and is doing things for quite positive reasons.
You mean motivation?
Motivation,
yes. I've read about that.
Yes.
Actors have it too, apparently.
Yes. So I find it quite interesting to explore what Iago's motivations might be, especially in a modern setting, so turning him into Jack. I can actually make decisions, whereas if we're writing an essay about Iago, we've only got a certain amount of leeway, I suppose, in imagining what might be driving him. He's one of Shakespeare's weirdest, I think, if not the weirdest, but that gave me quite a fertile ground for exploring.
Can I ask you the bridge then between academic understanding of a character, which is what you clearly are able to bring to it, a lit crit position almost, and that ability to be creative with it thereafter? Because what you've done is you've analysed the role within the Shakespeare context, but then you are plucking that, recontextualising in a modern British environment, and you're changing the dynamic of the story, as we've established. How easy is it for you to make that bridge from, it sounds a dreadful thing to say, from a cold analytical position to a warm creative one?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. That's kind of me all over, is that I'm trying to constantly bridge that gap with my academia, getting in influences from my performance or experience from my performance, and then also from my performance being influenced by proper rigorous academia, really understanding a text in that kind of way. I don't necessarily see them as separate things. Not when it's a creative project like this, and not when it's a creative project that's based on something else. So it's my way of analysing Shakespeare is writing this piece. I suppose it's a different expression of the same kind of thing you'd be doing if you were writing your essay, which I did. I studied this at GCSE, which is why it's come up. We did it at school, all-boys school, and I was Desdemona.
Oh, right.
It wasn't quite the same thing.
We were Henry IV Part 1 people, so don't worry. Every school has their favourite.
Yes. So yeah, I don't necessarily see there being a problem as long as it's consciously juggled, that I don't want it to be a lecture in any way. And I also wouldn't want to say that my view of Othello is the only view. I suppose that's one reason why I would do a creative project rather than an essay. I don't want to stamp it and say that's in its box now, there we go. It's like, here's a kind of living, breathing idea of what that might entail.
So the analysis is a means to an end. But there is a further question, isn't it? That we know that in your adaptation you had decided upon a musical as the way forward. You could have done it as a speech marks a straight play. Why did you decide that a musical was the best way of exploring the Iago's story?
There are two answers to this. The prosaic one is that I write musicals.
Yeah.
I don't think you'd want to see a play that I wrote necessarily, but the more kind of integral reason would be that I wanted to represent the ways in which Jack's scheming influences other people, and so they can take on his music in the same way that they take on his mindset as he kind of poisons them against each other. There's an abstraction that you get in musical theatre, or can get in musical theatre, which I really like as a kind of colour, and I think it suits this slightly weird emotional place of Othello when it's he says, she says, and...
Well, I don't want to get too highfalutin, but are we saying a Brechtian dissonance is in fact actually allowing one to explore better? But one doesn't think of Brecht as a gateway into emotion.
No, okay, here we go.
No, this is good. I'm enjoying.
You get me excited about this kind of stuff. I would say that there's almost a doorway into emotional stuff through Brecht. There's a number in so far it's in the first act of Bang Out of Line, It May Migrate, where most of the cast kind of step forward. They remove their hoods. It's set in Manchester, that kind of poorer people. They remove their hoods, which have been a kind of barrier against the world. And we have this one kind of 2-minute song, which is just the kind of heart out to the audience, which I say was a Brechty thing. We've broken the idea that this is a narrative, but instead of desiccating it, instead of turning it into something academic, it's turned it into something where a person and a person feel something for each other. One of the best bits of feedback we got about Bang Out of Line when we've done it was this decidedly toffee kind of upper middle class couple, quite old, came up to me and were kind of shocked but positively talking about the plight of the working class. And I thought, well, that's kind of, we've achieved our objective here if we've managed to make these people really feel something for characters that are completely outside of their day-to-day existence.
Oh, fantastic. And it's interesting, the idea that you can use, I don't want to keep using the phrase, but Brechtian alienation as a way of making a connection. That seems almost counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yes.
So how had you managed to do that? As I say, you've explained it to me in a way that actually it was a way of unlocking a door. That you were using Brecht as a way of actually breaking what was being seen to allow connection. But that doesn't happen very often. Is that fair, or completely?
I think it's fair that it doesn't happen very often. You might want to see it as a grander narrative of more and more realism. Realism is good. Acting realism and realism of speech, having normal scenes that a person would actually say and then move on to the next scene that is sequential. That's not the only way. I think we get more, it's richer if we break things apart. That's another reason for doing the music in the second act. Things really kind of disintegrate, and I can represent that in terms of having small scenes which are interspersed with songs and commentary that are not necessarily happening in the same physical place. It's not realism in that way. We've broken the realism, arguably in a Brechty way, and maybe that's a truer expression of modern life, hopefully at least.
Forgive me, I'm quite interested in this. I like the idea that through abstraction, that through the peeling away speech marks of realism, and I'm putting a lot of speech marks all over this, they're littered, frankly, it's possible to get to some kind of inner core from which, once again, here are those speech marks, truth may be found. So you obviously believe in truth.
Yes.
An emotional truth, or an intellectual truth, or both.
An emotional, intellectual truth, why not? Well, let's mix those together, but it's happening in the audience, not as one character who's really like feeling it. I'm not a Stanislavski devotee, as you might be able to tell.
And well done, by the way. That is the right answer.
I feel that the actor's job is probably to make that feeling in the audience in the same way that the writer's job is to elicit the feeling in the audience. I think that's much better done outside of the realms of, let me use my own air quotes, realism. I think irrealism, unrealism, I don't know, surrealism is much more real than realism. Soundbite?
No, that's very good. I mean, you're right. It's the way of escaping the labels, isn't it? We all live in shorthand worlds, but in fact we don't.
Yeah.
This might sound, forgive me, our conversation, I think, to some casual listeners would sound a little bit highfalutin, to use the old-fashioned phrase. But actually, I'd like to illustrate a situation where it completely isn't, because actually a non-diegetic song, which is essentially what musicals are full of, is immediately a non-realistic situation, and yet they're almost always used for emotional enhancement. They're often, obviously, to enhance the narrative as well. But they are, people often say when the emotion of the character is so strong they burst into song. That's what the song's for. Yeah. It's a fairly thumbnail sketch way of saying it. But actually, that is exactly what you've been talking about, in the sense that you've gone from a speech marks realistic to a non-realistic situation. So you've got the dissonance, you've got the alienation. But it hasn't taken you to an intellectual insight, although it can do. It's taken you to an emotional insight into the character. So people who watch musicals are used to this. We're just talking about it. Yeah. I suppose is what I'm trying to say. So really, what I've just said for the last few minutes is please come back.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think... I think where the intellectualism would happen would be if the characters are suddenly spouting intellectual comments and it becomes a tirade or...
polemic.
A polemic, exactly, that's the word I was looking for.
Here it is.
Whereas I want the audience to think that. I'm certainly thinking that, but the characters are not thinking that. That was one of my challenges, actually, with Bang Out of Line, because the characters are unsophisticated. They have to talk in the way that they would actually genuinely talk to each other, whilst carrying all of this meaning that I want to come across in the audience. The characters constantly break, unless it was another Brechty kind of thing where the actors start spouting stuff, but that's not what Bang Out of Line is about, I guess. It's we need to elicit that response in the audience, not in the characters.
So let's get on to the score. Now, you are, I think I should say this as a contextual thing, you're currently studying for a PhD on Stephen Sondheim and his work. But how far has he influenced your writing career, would you say? Let me introduce the listeners to... There were 3 songs which we saw at the Writers' Playground, which are all available to see on your website.
Oh, yeah.
Rather splendidly. There's video footage of that. There's Sue Me.
Sue You.
Sue You, I do apologise. Yeah, Sue Me is by Frank Lesser, isn't it, from Guys and Dolls. I do apologise. I knew suing came into it. Sue You, which is fast, furious, amusing, whilst representing a pent-up anger in its own way. Got a lot of good responses from the audience.
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah,
sort of. I don't have the musical understanding that you will have, but to my ears it sounded sort of contrapunctual, and it sounded like a punctuated piece of music. Had a very interesting sort of rhythm and punchiness, which stemmed very strongly from the way it had been orchestrated, I thought. So that song was very good. But then by complete contrast was the one which was very much more Sondheim, which was the second one on your video list, which is about a policeman who's having to come to terms with...
Sure.
They're investigating a situation which is close to his family, and therefore he doesn't exactly have the emotional distancing able to deal with it. I forgot what the song's called.
It's called Suddenly It's Closer to Home.
Oh, there you are then, exactly as I've described. And then the third song was called Blue Murder.
Blue Murder, yeah.
But actually, although they were clearly from the same pen, and you must forgive me if I in any way misrepresent you here, they felt they had different influences and were, they're not copycat Sondheim. But that's my take, that's my view. I mean, forgive me, there's actual reference to the Spice Girls, Sue You, and you cleverly... I know very little about the oeuvre of the Girls of Spice, but I must say that I know enough about Wannabe to be able to recognise some of the tropes which you've managed to incorporate, whilst in no way ripping off. Right, that's me, carry on.
Sure. Okay, so I suppose a few different things to pick up on there. About it being slightly different, one maxim I live by in my writing, I've picked this up from Julian Wolford, who was my teacher at Goldsmiths, was that one way into the music is to think about what those characters would be listening to. With the two female songs, Sue You and Blue Murder, Sue You is inspired by Lily Allen. I'm not sure how into Lily Allen.
Of the young lady songstress, her hit parades. She's done tremendously well in her sheet music sales.
So it's got that bounce to it, almost a reggae feel, I suppose, in places, and a strange brightness, even though there's an edge to the lyrics. And then the Blue Murder, I suppose, was inspired largely by Adele, that kind of torch song, that power, the screaming from the core of a woman scorned. And then in the middle is slightly different. It's not exactly what the character would have been listening to, but it was inspired by the music you get on like The Bill or Silent Witness. It's got a certain complex harmony, but still a kind of 80s pulse to it.
Well, that's really interesting because it felt like, forgive me, that one felt a Sondheim-esque number to me. Yeah. It also, the resonances I was getting was sort of Marry Me a Little kind of thing from Company.
Oh, on the first one? Which one?
Song number 2.
Song number 2.
The one whose title I can never remember. I'm so sorry.
Suddenly It's Closer to Home. Yeah.
And that's only my feeling.
Now you see, what I'd probably say is the sun-timiness about it is the actual nuts and bolts of the music. It's jumping around in thirds.
Yes, I thought the verse sounded more sun-time than the chorus.
Okay.
If that helped.
And I wonder if it's just because it's a transcript of this guy's thoughts, similar to, I don't know, what's that one in Into the Woods? Was that me?
I mean,
was that
narrow
him?
it down a bit further than that.
Yeah,
that
one
one
from the entire score of Into the Woods. The baker's wife sings it just after the meeting in the woods.
This one, the one before she gets squished.
Yeah. Spoilers.
Yeah. Oh, come on, it was 1987.
So she's actually kind of going back and forth on herself. What's this? The interesting thing for me about the character, he's called Ryan Babbage, is that he's a proper lad. He's not particularly in touch with his emotions in the way that quite a lot of musical theatre characters really are. Suddenly they know exactly what they feel.
Yeah, there's a great deal of emotional intelligence, isn't there?
Yeah, Bang Out of Line is not very emotionally intelligent, largely because I'm not very emotionally intelligent. It takes me a while to work out what I feel, and so it takes him until what we might call the bridge to realise what this is all about. It's kind of a lot more connected to his backstory than he wanted to admit initially. So he tries to portray himself as the one who's fighting the good fight, whereas really he's trying to make up for what he's failed to do in the past.
It's an attempt at redemption that may be misguided.
Oh, certainly misguided. That's what I love about the story. This character is Brabantio. If you're following the Othello references, kind of enlarged from where he is in the.
So he's
in Shakespeare play.
Gigantio.
Sorry. And he kind of becomes a bit of a hero of the second act as he tries to solve all of these stories, all these problems.
Resolution master, if you like. At least in an attempted way.
Yeah. Again, to kind of provide my own spoilers, he clearly fails. And larking back to what we were talking about earlier about the hero of your own narrative, despite this horrific, everyone's dead on the bed. Not quite written yet, and not going to be quite like that, but certainly what we would view as a negative ending for Jack is the victory.
What is still known as a Shakespearean tragedy, yes.
Yeah. But for him, he's achieved his objective, so it's a happy ending for him, if not for the audience.
And as you say, for individuals, their stories are not necessarily part of the whole, they are the individual's role.
Yeah.
So, Bang Out of Line.
Sure.
How did Bang Out of Line come to be? Now, you obviously studied the piece, it's been lurking in your mind. When did you decide there's a musical to be written here, this is the musical I want to do? Why and when?
Oh, it was because I was told I have to write a musical.
So this is part of your Goldsmiths?
This is the Goldsmiths MA in musical theatre. Within that, there's a module where we write our own pieces or produce those pieces. Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh,
I didn't see your year, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry.
Missed it. But yeah, there's always a slew of good stuff if you can find out when they're on. September time with the proper ones. So yeah, it was out of necessity. I had to write our musical. I needed to choose what to write about. I love Othello, but I also knew I wanted to write something about Manchester, where I'm from.
And that doesn't obviously connect, does it?
No, no, not necessarily. I've kind of weaned myself off a certain Manchester way of thinking. Soap opera. So, well, yes, it's not quite like that. I don't know quite what it is about me that doesn't necessarily ring Noel Gallagher to you, but maybe that's also part of why I'm.
It's the erudition I'm thinking.
Oh, right.
Carry on.
Aha, well, there you go. Maybe that's your misapprehension of
prejudice,
prejudice against the Northern.
No. Prejudice against Noel Gallagher.
Oh, himself. So what I'm trying to say is that perhaps through writing stuff like this, I'm trying to find my own connection to my homeland, in the same way that if I was from a different country, I would also want to write about that different country. Whilst, I mean, I've emigrated down to London. Rightly or wrongly, I understand that that's a loaded thing to do with the brain drain, and there's a great theatre scene in Manchester. But I feel for what I want to do, I had to move down to London, certainly to study, because you have to be in a particular place. And then maybe writing this show, which is largely about Manchester as much as it is about individual characters. It's a way of connecting.
And is it about Manchester in a way that it's as much about individual characters? Could it be set in the Wirral? Could it be set in Scotland? The Isle of Wight?
I think there are a few.
Midsummer? Perhaps Midsummer is the very place it ought to be set. But
I think there are a few language things that you wouldn't get outside of Manchester. But I think it would have to be in a city. I don't think it would make much sense as it is.
It's urban.
Yeah, it's certainly urban. But I wouldn't want to preclude in 50 years' time someone reimagining it in whatever new metropolis has come to the forefront. Yeah.
I'd like to explore a couple of extra things with you, though.
Sure.
You've said something very interesting, I think, about yourself, and I don't know how much you're being sincere, but you said that you do not identify in yourself emotional intelligence immediately.
I said that, yeah.
You did
that's
say
true.
that. And that seems surprising to me, because you've spoken very intelligently, full stop, about what we've been talking about. You obviously have a tremendous grasp of your characters, of your narrative, of the whole thing, and you cannot help, the thing that we know about Othello is it's about passion. Whether those passions are positive or negative, they're there. The unfettered rage is, in fact, perhaps easier to channel because it's sometimes without too much intellectual support. But obviously I'm not saying this very well, but there are emotional ranges from A to Z throughout this piece, I have no doubt. And indeed, you illustrated them in the 3 songs you gave us. You gave us a lovely range of emotional positions. You've been intellectualizing them to me to describe the songs. So you clearly do have intellectual intelligence in relation to what they're doing, but you suggested that sort of slog, you ground yourself to get there. Is the way you've described yourself a disadvantage for a composer? Or is it the fact that you have to... This sounds dreadful, but your sort of coping mechanisms of thinking your way through them to get to where you're going, which appears to be what you're telling me. Actually, perfectly valid way of living the world, by the way, but is that a different way of doing things which is actually an advantage? There's no right or wrong.
Sure. I think coping mechanism is actually a really interesting phrase to have used. And by emotional intelligence, I kind of mean in the heat of the moment and really feeling, being aware of what I feel. I guess that doesn't really happen, but by sitting down and writing
can you just boil this down? You are or you aren't aware of what you feel? Or you are or you aren't aware? You aren't aware of what you feel, or you aren't aware of why you feel it?
Genuinely both.
Oh, right.
I like different types. No, this is fine. I enjoy this. So, writing things down gives you a lot longer to think about things. And from a craft point of view, the slightly boring job part of it is even unbridled rage. In a musical, I can't sit at some manuscript paper and kind of, I'm just shaking my arms, but you can't necessarily see that. Rage at it. You can come up with an idea in rage, but then you definitely have to intellectualize it so someone else can reproduce that. It has to be sheet music, it has to be a script. So yeah, I suppose there is a withdrawal from the immediacy of that emotion as part of it.
But that's true of drama anyway, isn't it? Because writing and words and music are merely a way of expressing what their cues. They're cues for an emotional response that you will see on stage.
Yeah.
You can't actually get genuine emotion down on a sheet of paper. A sheet of paper is a sheet of paper.
Yeah. I mean, maybe you can't put emotions into words or even actions. There's always some kind of shorthand happening there. And then there's just an extra level now that we're having to put it into a Word document.
Yeah.
So I guess what I meant by emotional intelligence is that heat of the moment feeling of it, whereas maybe because I have to sit and pick myself apart in order to work out what I feel, I've become maybe adept at doing that to other people as well, whether they want me to or not. And so then you can translate that into exploring what a character might feel and then how an actor might portray that.
I think another word for this, or a synonym is psychology in a way, is it not?
Yeah.
I think good writers, people who get character, are psychologists. They may not realise they are, but they have absorbed and understood somehow something in others as much as in themselves.
Sure.
Are you an emotional person, if you don't mind me asking? Would someone say you were passionate in your day-to-day life? Oh my God, the price has gone up again.
I
Time
think
to kick the imaginary cat? Or?
I think in some ways, and then maybe not in others. I guess we've all got our own. No. I'm just talking. We've all got our own idiosyncrasies. I cry when something is really well written, but not when a relative has died until a few weeks later. It takes a while for that kind of thing to process.
And are you aware of the manipulation of emotion? By which I mean, because I was raised in a very emotional household, which is why I'm such a cold fish now. And the thing I resent most in any theatrical environment, whether it be musical or otherwise, is the sense of being manipulated into an emotional position. That's not to say... I appreciate at one level it's all manipulation, because that is what you're there for, it's a stage. But, how shall I put it? Emotion that's tempered in such a way that I feel like it seems like a natural rise from what the character's been saying, I can respond to emotionally. When I feel that... I'm going to use the word Disney, I mean Disney no harm when I say this, but because they're perhaps sometimes drawing an emotional position from younger children who perhaps need the stronger cues. There is a sense that when you're a sophisticated old man like I am, you may laugh at that, it's that you feel that you're being pushed into a position. And I don't like feeling I'm being pushed into an emotional box.
Sure. I think maybe that's to do with the kind of artfulness. You can achieve the same amount of emotional manipulation without the audience necessarily feeling manipulated.
Yes.
It'll depend on exactly the words that have been written and exactly the way that it's been directed.
But if you can see the working...
If you can see the working, maybe you've failed. If the audience is being forced into a straitjacket of one way of thinking, maybe you've failed. Perhaps making art should be about offering it to an audience to make their own interpretations, which hopefully will be what you want them to think, but maybe don't force them, otherwise they'll react quite negatively. I know I felt that in the theatre quite a lot. It's like, oh, you want me to feel this? And that kind of contrary part of yourself just rejects that and thinks, well, no, I'm just not going to engage.
I've spotted it. Everything is diminished. So, when did you start with Bang Out of Line? You said that was at... what year was that?
Ooh, blimey, I think that was 2012.
And obviously it was performed at the end of the year. What state was it in? Was it complete? Act 1? Where were you up to?
So we had to write 45 minutes,
yeah.
And you could fill that time however you wanted. I decided to do a condensed first act. So I'd had an idea of the entire story arc, otherwise you wouldn't be able to engage with it, but I'd written closely, more or less, that up to the first dramatic end point of the first act, with a few bits missing so that it would fit into the time. We then did a version at the Guildford Fringe Festival, which was really cool, which was more or less a full-length first act.
Was that 2013?
I think it will have been, yes.
Yeah.
Pretty much a year later.
Yeah.
And now I'm at the kind of wrapping up stage of the second act.
So the end is in sight, isn't it?
Yes. I have. I've written the penultimate song now. That doesn't mean to say I'm necessarily going to go and write the final scene. I've got a few other bits to tinker around with. But I know now the trajectory of everybody and where everyone is emotionally as they arrive.
So it's now the graft of doing it more than anything else.
Yeah. There's a kind of an emotional wrench that I have to now set on paper. What has been an unknown, suddenly it has to become a decided thing. What happens at the end? Who dies?
Now that's very interesting. So you did not know when you set out how you were going to finish it?
Not precisely. We've got the Shakespeare obviously to jump off.
There's a template.
There is a template, and I had a few ideas, and a few ideas that I wanted to avoid as well. I was really wary of killing off all the female characters. I've got precious few anyway. It's very heavily skewed towards male characters.
As Shakespeare often is.
Well, yeah, I suppose.
You can't all be Desdemona.
Can't all be Desdemona. I'm fairly sure she's going to have to die, I'm afraid. And then do I kill the Amelia character? And then there's only one other girl anyway. So that's not absolutely decided even yet.
So you knew the general arc, but you didn't know the detail, perhaps.
Yeah.
Might be the best way to do it.
Yeah. I knew I didn't want to take a word for word. Well, certainly not word for word, but an event for event recapitulation of the Shakespeare text. I knew I wanted to reimagine it.
It's a proper adaptation.
Sure, it's an adaptation. I also wasn't sure that however many people dying on a bed works in a modern setting. I think we would read that very differently if it's modern dress, if it's modern speech, and then we kill everyone at the end.
Yes. Unless you're doing the EastEnders music, it may not have the resonance that people want.
True. Not everyone gets run over on Christmas.
Yeah.
But
I'm leaving the square forever.
Get out of my pub. That's how I learned how to speak Southern. I can't speak Southern.
Is it?
But
well, it's Shakespeare. You're a bard.
Yeah, you're a bard.
I thank you.
Oh wow.
I thank you. Has people often say that they start off writing something and then the characters, if you like, develop this life of their own, and it veers out of their control, not in a way that's uncontrollable. It just you are no longer quite the master of what's happening. The characters seize it from you.
Sure.
Anything of that?
Well, the character Sarah, who is Desdemona, it took me a good while to work out kind of why she's there. In the Shakespeare, it's quite difficult to tease out a real person, perhaps. Yeah. It's there to be found, but it's buried. In Desdemona, who's kind of there to suffer against Othello.
A touch of a cipher.
A little bit. Not that we would want to say some stuff about the great master.
But he's not going to sue.
So I was trying to find what drives her, and this is so... Can I use the word wanky on a podcast?
You absolutely can.
This is so wanky, but...
Just don't want the mime, all right?
No. But it came to be that she more or less told me what she was about, rather than the other way around. It didn't feel like I was creating her drive, her backstory. She kind of told me that. And then equally, her brother, who's the character who sings Suddenly It's Closer to Home, he... has become a much bigger character in the second act than I ever intended him to be. Certainly hadn't imagined it from the Shakespeare text where Brabantio, he's there a lot in the beginning and then kind of crops back very late in the day. In my version, he's trying to solve the mystery. He becomes a definite hero of this cop drama. And that wasn't planned. That happened because it seemed interesting, and it was how he wanted to engage with his own story.
I'm absolutely fascinated by this idea that you, in fact, immerse yourself in the world in which you've created, and then explore it, and then it gives you the answers you need. Because that's a perfectly legitimate way of doing it, but other people can and do say, right, I'm going to start now with my piece of paper, go from A to B, I will have worked it all out, all the ramifications, and then the next stage for me is just writing that up. Not just writing it up, because there is more to it than that. But, there are people who plan, and that's what they've got. And then there are people such as yourself, it seems to me, who are pushing that envelope, exploring, getting their hands dirty in the world itself.
Yeah. One of my things is I really dislike just having to sit down and write it out. So even if I was doing that, I'd always want to be tinkering with what I've come up with. So I do plan a lot. But then it tends to not really stick to that.
Yeah.
And I just let it go. It tends to end up
organic.
I was going to use more real, but I know that's a loaded term, having discussed.
Can you put those air quotes around there?
Yeah, yes.
That sounds fantastic. Are you happy with it?
Yes. There are things I want to tweak before it starts going out. And then I do kind of subscribe to Sondheim's position that you don't finish the musical, you just kind of stop working on it.
Unless you're Jerome Kern, of course, who carried on writing songs for Showboat for the rest of his life.
Oh, right.
Apparently there's enough songs, if you did a version with all the songs in, it would run to about 24 hours, apparently.
Oh, blimey.
That's not just songs, obviously, but it's the setup for a song, etc., etc.
Oh gosh, I might have to look into that. That's really interesting, because Showboat is like such a monument and such an important thing, so to have more of it, I think that sounds really exciting.
More of it. Okay. I mean, there's a few shows in the world where you pick from the score. You have what you want from it, and that's one of them. I mean, obviously,
kind of buffet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even and listeners will be aware that I bang on about this all the time, but even back to Gilbert and Sullivan, if you do Radigal, you've got a selection of endings, a selection of patter songs. You pick the one you want because it was jiggled around and tweaked and pushed and remodeled, if you like, and so one version of Radical is never going to be the same as the other one, even from a score point of view. But there we are. So, but where then? Where for Bang Out of Line?
Where for Bang Out of Line?
Where does the line start, in fact, from being banged out of?
In order to step off it, yeah. I'm in the process. There's the will to get it on...
Is that the Will Shakespeare?
The will. Sorry. To get it on for a kind of scratch thing in front of investors. But it's still very much in the subjunctive kind of, well, is it going to happen? We'll see. Loads of people want to be involved in performing it, and there is the will from producers, so hopefully that will be...
Well, there is sort of support and interest. Good
again, I don't want to name drop or whatever.
No, I'm not asking that, but it's just good to know that it's not standing in splendid isolation.
No. I think it is viable. I'm seeing it more as a London Fringe show, rather than a kind of Wicked. It needs
not straight into the Palladium then.
No. It needs an intimacy, and also just aesthetically, I quite like the abstraction. We spoke about abstraction of a black box situation. So it was in the Tristan Bates when we first did it with Goldsmiths, which suited it down to the ground. I just saw Gods and Monsters at the Southwark Playhouse. I think Southwark Playhouse would be the kind of place, if you imagine, for that kind of thing.
But this is merely one flowering of your musical writing talent. I know that you've written... we'll talk about your musical direction later. But tell me a little about the farce based around cream teas.
Well, this is quite different, as you say. This was also a Goldsmiths project. This was kind of our mock for the final project. We had to write a 15-minute musical, and because it was...
It's been done.
It's been done. And because it was 2012, we were instructed to write about the Olympics. Now, I'm sorry, Julian, if you're listening, but us musical theatre types were not desperately happy with that brief, but we went at it anyway, and I thought, well, I can't just write a story about an athlete, largely because I don't know anything about sport.
No, that's fine. That's a perfectly acceptable position.
So I took an askance view, and I wrote a short musical about Cornish separatists who were petitioning the International Olympic Committee to be viewed as a separate country from the rest of the UK, which would springboard their independence. This was before the Scottish independence debate.
This has got all the hallmarks of Richard Curtis films. Hold on to this idea, because someone will make a lot of money out of it.
At the moment, it needs a bit of fleshing out since it's 15 minutes. It's one scene in which this father and daughter team of Cornish separatists turn up and harangue this poor Portuguese official in his office. And yeah, it's a farce. There's lots of parodic elements to it. And actually, it gave birth to the song Suyu. I don't know whether you know this.
No, I did not.
It was extended into the version that you've seen now. But this was the clincher. This was how they won, was because she seduced the official. And then the father comes back and says, "Oh, you've
touched my daughter.
You touched my daughter. Now you do something for us, and I'll not tell the papers. I'm gonna sue you on this." So that's where that kind of came from.
Now, you said that was a mock, if you like. Can I ask, what's your role? What's your view on what I call craft, the finessing of lyrics? Are you? And what I'm saying here, I suppose, is the difference between a carefully constructed song time or a pop lyric. I'm not making a value judgment on either, but do you have
Yeah. I mean, I do have strong views, I suppose. I think craft is exactly the right word for it, rather than art. The right word for what? I think the right word for musical theatre lyric writing. So I would completely distance that craft from the craft of writing pop music, pop lyrics, which is much more about the sound world, much more about the a kind of direct emotionality between the person who's writing those lyrics and the performance.
It's emotional immediacy, I would think.
Yeah,
in a nutshell. I mean, obviously not always, but...
Whereas, as we've discussed, the musical theatre lyric will probably not have an emotional immediacy because it will have been intellectualised.
That's not always true, is it? But I know what you're saying.
Did that answer your question?
It did. But forgive me, and this is the curse of having people who are interested. In Sue You, there is the rhyme. Well, you rhyme rather amusingly, and you get a laugh. What am I going to name?
Oh, I can't think now. There's a few. Right.
Okay, I'm going to go for twat and fact.
Fact.
Yeah. And that's a pop lyric for me, but...
Yeah. And it's a pop lyric...
But it gets a laugh, and I saw it get a laugh. It got a huge roar. You know, it's worth the risk.
It's worth the risk.
Maybe response.
In another defence, if I need to defend...
Sorry, it wasn't
not at all. Would be to... that is very much... consciously inspired by the Spice Girls and Lily Allen.
As you said, it was a sort of popish number.
I think Lily Allen would definitely get away with that rhyme. She might not even pronounce the C very strongly, and in fact, to make it work so it would happen in performance like that. Yes, I'm very bad at taking my own medicine in terms of discipline of lyrics. I try as much as I can. One of my favourite bits of bang out of line is I rhyme put with shut. Now, my good...
Sorry,
I rhymed put with shut, which I'll say very strongly in my northern accent, rather than, I believe, put and shut.
Yes, as in putt or put, as in I'm putting this on the table or I'm putting a golf.
Yeah. Oh no! But, is that different? Oh gosh, ignorant northerner that I am.
No.
Is that
cultural diversity between the two of us? Is how I see it.
Let's share our cultures, shall we? As in putting something on a table.
Oh, yes,
I put.
Would be the London way.
Okay, what would be put? And then shut a door.
As in shut.
Shut.
I shut a door
I don't
and
see
then
that.
I put something on the table.
That sounds rude to me. I wouldn't say shut.
Would you not?
Not on the radio.
What does that sound like to you then? Forgive me.
SHAT.
Oh, is it? Oh, well, we can say that. So you're saying it sounds like shat?
A past participle of the verb to shit. Yes.
I shat on your carpet.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I should be careful not to use it that way. But I think this is genuinely interesting.
But in Northern, in Manchester, put and shut definitely rhyme.
Yeah.
And probably don't even have a T at the end.
But this is part of a much wider story, which I'm sure we won't discuss today. But lovely, we love it. You know, this is the American English lyrics. There are, and Sondheim does this. One of the last songs he's written, God. Do you know the song God?
Oh, not a fan.
Oh, right. He wrote it specifically for the 80 Years of Sondheim review.
Okay.
I think that was on a couple of years. Sondheim on Sondheim. And he's taking the pee out of himself, you know, how his absolutely devoted fans really revere him like a god.
Oh, yes.
But he rhymes God, which is, I would say, in a London way, or I actually think an English way, with that sound. So there are, if you were an English-speaking person who sang in an English accent, you know, if you were from the Gilbert and Sullivan Noel Coward tradition, you would have trouble making that song work.
Yes, of course.
Because, in fact, you get that with even something as much more banal as hair. When Manchester, England, the lyric is, I believe in God, and I believe that God believes in Claude, as I would say it, but of course it's Claude.
Yeah.
For my ears, he's called Claude, which can't be right. But there we go.
It's all good for us Brits, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I see that as a strength of lyric that is really using the character's own accent and actually kind of playfully.
Accent and idiomatic speech.
Using that for rhyme. Sondheim, I think, has done that intentionally. Largely because I am one of those devotees to Sondheim. I would say that that's probably on purpose. But then there's a song. I can play it for you. Look.
On your air piano.
It's got one of those with the title at the end of the line. Down the block, there's a riot, and I'll buy it.
That's Merrily Roll On.
I think it's a one-off kind of song. With your love, what more do I need? What more do I need?
That's from Unsung Song Night.
Unsung, okay.
Yeah, you're quite right.
Yes. Anyway, and there's
a two-ton child running wild upstairs. Is that the one?
Sure. Yeah. And then there's this huge passage of really idiomatic speech. Well, I suppose it's not really, but if you do it in a standard American accent, it's fine. If you do it in a New York accent, suddenly you understand why he's written those lyrics, because it's a taxi horn on the corner honks. Yeah. Sorry for my horrible accent. I adore every roar. Yeah. Oh gosh, I know a girl from New York.
You're making the point. You're making the point really well.
Yeah. I think if you use it as a strength, it's great. And so I try at least to do that in Bang Out of Line, to find that Manchester patois, for want of a less wanky term.
I mean, you're quite right. The idiomatic speech. And you sort of mentioned that the song Sue You came from the Cornish piece. What was that called, by the way?
It was called The Cream Tea Conspiracy.
Fantastic. But as you say, there's a Portuguese and two Cornish characters, and you both immediately think, well, all three of those are going to have accents. Did any of that come up in that? You were talking about creating interesting rhyme possibilities, not necessarily deliberately, but something that could come out of those characters you built. Did that happen?
To be perfectly honest, this was a learning experience for me when it was very clear that some of those things are not going to rhyme when you sing it in Cornish. So, absolutely.
Let's spot a bother, my lover.
This was, I think it was Chance and Hands, which I can almost get away with in Manc. You certainly can in like normal RP English, and Chance and Hands, I think, in a kind of Cornish way. I played it for Mike Dixon, famous MD.
We know Mike on this program.
Yes. And he loved it. Yeah. Bless him, because he's kind of from that area, I believe. But he was very quick to point out all of those holes. So I learned from that, definitely.
And were you able to touch any Portuguese friends for comments? Or?
Well, the guy who played it is originally from Portugal.
Oh, right, okay.
He, the function of the music in that in that small piece was to emphasise the Cornish people's weirdness and their heightened reality. So he doesn't start singing until the very end, and they've kind of pulled him into their own madcap scheme. So it didn't matter too much, he just sang it in his own... they had a kind of national anthem for Cornwall, which he had to sing at the end.
So, what was that called?
I think it was called Cornwall.
Oh, right, there we are.
Surprisingly.
Well, you have all the hallmarks of a good anthem. And anthems are often sung at the end of a show. So, for the moment, James, it's been fantastic talking to you.
Great.
And I hope to be able to speak to you again to explore your career just a little bit further.
Oh, I'd love to, yeah.
Musical talk. Well, there we are, James Robert Ball. I genuinely enjoyed that conversation. I really enjoyed listening to it again as I was editing it for this episode of Musical Talk. And I can assure you, if you enjoyed it this week, you'll enjoy next week too, because we have the second part of that conversation with James, when we'll be talking about such diverse musicals as Rent, High School Musical, Wonderful Town, Passion, Evening Primrose, and we'll be really looking into the world of Stephen Sondheim. All that next week. But James himself is busy in the West End, so if you want to go and see him in performance, you certainly can, because he's currently the musical director of the Blues Brothers Christmas Special, which is running at the Arts Theatre at Leicester Square until the 10th of January. It's his debut in the West End as a musical director, and whilst it's a very different show from anything Sondheim might write, it is of course a hoot. And you can also go to James's website, which is jamesrobertball, all one word, .com. And you can follow him on Twitter at @JR_Ball. Well, that's it for this week, but as you can hear, I've left you hanging because there's so much more coming up in next week's edition. So do join me again then. But until that time, there's only one word for me to say. It begins with G and ends in udbye. The sharper amongst you will realise that it's probably... Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2015. And don't forget to follow us on the social networks, Facebook and Twitter. And you can follow me on Twitter at Musical Talk Thos. Are you Jason Robert Ball for your professional purposes, or Jason?
James.
James, oh God.
That's quite important.
Yes, it is, isn't it? Yes. Oops. All these triple-barrel names in the business.
Yeah, with Robert in the middle as well.
But so you're James Robert Ball.
James Robert Ball.
Fine.